Hello and welcome from whatever part of the world you hail. I'm Nancy Stafford, Chair of the International Law Section of the American Bar Association, along with the leaders of IABA Human Rights Committee, UIA, the Law Society of England and Wales, and the Inter-American Bar Association. I welcome you to the second annual Rule of Law Webathon. This year's 24-hour webathon will focus on how economic and social development interrelates with the rule of law. There are lots of issues to discuss, so let's get started with the first panel, Perspectives on the Rule of Law, Impact on Sustainable Development.
Thank you, Nancy. I am Lourdes Bines. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. We welcome you to the lawyers across the globe and around the clock for the rule of law, an unprecedented rule of law 24-hour program, webathon. This panel, presented by the Inter-American Bar Association in collaboration with the Institute of Brazilian Lawyers, or Instituto de Advogados Brasileiros, will discuss perspectives on the rule of law, impact on sustainable development. We are the first of 12 diverse panels being offered for 24 continuous hours by bar associations worldwide to celebrate, address challenges, and defend the rule of law, all in this YouTube channel. The rule of law is society's legal underpinning, guaranteeing human rights and creating economic opportunity and development. And we lawyers are often the first line of defense. Though the rule of law is not merely the stock and trade of lawyers, it is our core value. The universal commitment of the world's lawyers to the rule of law inspired us and many other law societies to join forces and launch this first of its kind webathon. We are proud to be part of it and invite you to enjoy the whole 24-hour cycle. We would like to, disclaim that the views expressed during this event are those of our panelists and don't represent either or the institutions organizing these events. Without more, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker who will open this segment and the whole event. I am honored to introduce the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, as our keynote speaker who will offer us the event opening remarks. Luis Almagro is the Secretary General, as we mentioned, of the OAS, and he was re-elected for a second term as Secretary General on March 2020. It was really a defining year for everybody around the globe. And it definitely, posed a lot of challenges in every aspect and dimension of life, but especially the rule of law. He was, we have to say, he was elected, almost unanimously, with the support, almost unanimous of the vote. He also has been foreign minister of his native country, Uruguay, and has a vast experience in international and regional affairs. The focus or theme of his administration, he declared would be to more rights for more people and to be the voice of the voiceless. And we found that and like to remark that as Secretary General, Almagro has prioritized defense of democracy and human rights in his daily work and has not hesitated to speak out when democracy and human rights are being tempered. A career diplomat, he has extensive regional and international experience and has done really, an amazing job representing also his country before he represents the Organization of American States. Without more, we would like to give the floor and welcome Secretary General Luis Almagro. Thank you. And before we start, we don't want to really start this without expressing our voice of solidarity with the people of Ukraine, with the brave people of Ukraine. Thank you. Secretary General, the floor is yours. While he connects, we will actually give a little preview of the panel that we are going to be presenting after the opening remarks. And when we express our solidarity also with Ukraine, I want to recognize Irina Palashvili, who is, kindly, she is from Ukraine, and she had kindly accepted to join this panel on perspective of the rule of law, impact on sustainable development. And we will have, Jean-Michel Arrigui, who honors us also with his participation. He's the Secretary of Legal Affairs of the OAS. We will have Jad Kessler, the President of the Inter-American Bar Association. And we will have also Sidney Sanchez, the President of the Brazilian Institute of Lawyers. And we'll close the panel with Irina Palashvili from Ukraine, who will talk about perspectives of the rule of law, but also give us an interesting perspective from her experience as a person who had practiced law in an established democracy like the US, and also in a new democracy, we could say relatively new by historic times, democracy in Ukraine. Without more, we are giving the floor to the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro. Oh. Bienvenido, doctor Almagro, buenos días.
Buenos días, perdón, pero no tenía el link para entrar, así que tuve que conseguir todo de último momento. Gracias.
Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Buenos días, secretario general. El micro es suyo. Hemos tenido el honor de presentarlo. Well, good morning, Secretary General. This is in English. The floor is yours. We had the honor of introduce you already. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be with all of you. El desarrollo jurídico interamericano, el apoyo a las instituciones nacionales, son actividades prioritarias para la Organización de los Estados Americanos desde sus orígenes a finales del siglo XIX. Agradezco la invitación para participar de esta extensa jornada en torno a tantos temas relevantes del quehacer jurídico, tanto a nivel nacional como internacional, a las que nos convoca la Federación Interamericana de Abogados, junto con otras distinguidas instituciones. La OEA ha sido y es la primera instancia internacional que consagró entre sus propósitos que sus Estados miembros debían ser democracias representativas, que la cooperación al respeto del derecho internacional era piedra angular y que la protección de los derechos humanos un componente esencial a ser cumplido por todos. El Estado de Derecho, mejor aún el Estado democrático de Derecho, es una obligación internacional que todos nuestros países han reconocido en los instrumentos jurídicos interamericanos que los vinculan. La OEA no solo ha consagrado estos propósitos, sino que se ha dotado de medios para verificar su cumplimiento, asistir a los países cuando lo requieren y aprobar medidas cuando los violan. Algunos ejemplos: en materia de derechos humanos, la Declaración pionera de 1948, seguida la creación de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, la Convención Americana y la Corte Interamericana, han establecido un nivel de protección que ha asegurado el acceso a sus derechos a muchísimos ciudadanos de nuestros países. Hoy, sin duda, estamos mejor que décadas atrás. En lo que tiene que ver con el combate a la corrupción, también acá fuimos pioneros al adoptar la primera convención en la materia y el mecanismo de su seguimiento. Difícil es saber si hay hoy más o menos corrupción que antes, pero sí es claro que este terrible flagelo a nuestro Estado de Derecho es hoy objeto de acciones judiciales, de conocimiento por la opinión pública, fortalecimiento de las instituciones nacionales, de la adopción de leyes basadas en nuestras leyes modelos, como acceso a la información pública. Con respecto a la defensa de la democracia, es bien conocida la importancia que tienen hoy las misiones de observación electoral. Si el fraude fue durante buena parte de la historia en la regla general, hoy en buena medida debido a la observación electoral pasó a ser la excepción, y cuando se produce se conoce, se denuncia, se sanciona. La Carta de la OEA primero, resoluciones posteriores y finalmente la Carta Democrática Interamericana a partir de 2001 han ido fijando los elementos de la democracia a ser respetados por los países americanos y las consecuencias en caso de que sean alterados gravemente, los que van desde la asistencia que desde la Secretaría General podemos darle al país hasta las sanciones que pueden ser aplicadas por la Asamblea General. Los ejemplos son numerosos y también acá los éxitos han sido mayores que los fracasos, y hoy en general las instituciones democráticas son más respetadas que décadas atrás. Es cierto que hay dramáticos ejemplos de abierta violación a estos principios. No necesito darles detalles de violaciones de derechos humanos, a las normas fundamentales del derecho nacional e internacional que las dictaduras cometen en el hemisferio. Los ejemplos abundan, nosotros los hemos denunciado, ustedes los conocen. Pero si algo cambió con relación a las dictaduras anteriores, que la sociedad toda, aunque las padece, las sabe, y la comunidad internacional ya no puede ampararse en el desconocimiento. Si no actúa no es por no conocerlas, por complicidad en la acción o en la omisión. Eso no invalida las normas interamericanas. Los códigos penales no los eliminan los delitos que se cometen. Por el contrario, eso nos obliga a redoblar el compromiso con el respeto a las normas que todos hemos acordado y hacer todo lo que está a nuestro alcance para que se cumplan. En un plano más técnico, y por eso no tan visible, pero no menos importante, el Comité Jurídico Interamericano viene desde 1906 elaborando normas convencionales y leyes modelo que son guía para todos nuestros países en los campos más amplios del derecho internacional, tanto público como privado. Por supuesto queda mucho por hacer. El crimen organizado ha venido a socavar la legitimidad de instituciones, el narcotráfico infiltrado en la política a los más altos niveles del poder, los procesos judiciales que se alargan sin fin, llenando cárceles con gente sin condena, en condiciones infrahumanas, la falta de conciencia y de medidas adecuadas frente a las amenazas al medio ambiente, están entre las mayores preocupaciones a las que con los limitados recursos con los que contamos hemos venido dando la mayor atención. Todo ello requiere de un marco jurídico adecuado, actualizado, que agilice la cooperación jurídica y judicial entre nuestros estados. Ninguna de estas amenazas, espera nuevas leyes para desarrollarse. Por el contrario, aprovecha en su beneficio propio las lagunas y lentitudes jurídicas. De ahí la importancia de su trabajo como abogados agremiados en tan prestigiosas instituciones que participan en este encuentro. Su responsabilidad en estos tiempos es muy grande. Ya no alcanza a compensar en el orden jurídico de cada uno de nuestros países, en el campo de trabajo, los abogados, los jueces, los legisladores. No puede estar ajeno a lo que ocurre más allá de las fronteras nacionales. Más que nunca necesitamos, los abogados, renovar espacios de diálogo que nos permitan dar respuestas comunes, colectivas y eficaces. Agradezco mucho la posibilidad de estar hoy con ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, secretario general. Doctor Almagro, ha sido un honor realmente tenerlo usted con nosotros, inaugurando este evento, ¿no? Y bueno, celebramos el trabajo que se hace a nivel institucional y que hacen a través de la OEA también para promover el Estado de Derecho. Muchas gracias. Ahora vamos a continuar con el panel. Como mencionábamos, nuestro panel es sobre perspectivas del Estado de Derecho, impacto en el desarrollo sostenible. Hemos tenido las excelentes palabras inaugurales del secretario general Almagro. Excuse me, I'm switching to English. We are going to continue with this panel. We thank Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, for his excellent remarks. And we thank you also for being attending this event and all our panelists. This panel theme is Perspectives on the Rule of Law, Impact on Sustainable Development, as we mentioned before. And we have a terrific panel who will reflect about the importance of strengthening the rule of law for economic and social development. But it's really an element for peace too, the rule of law at the national and international levels. And also the bottom line of this is accountability and equal treatment under the law. And there are many other aspects. The advancement of the rule of law at the national and international levels is essential to achieving economic growth and sustainable development. That's been reflected also in the UN Declaration on the Rule of Law. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the 2012 United Nations Declaration of the Rule of Law. So it's very timely to reflect upon this topic that is really the main overarching theme of this webathon. Building on the declaration, UN member states place the rule of law, justice, and human rights at the core of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. However, the implementation of the broadly accepted concept and definition of the rule of law has faced challenges in certain parts of the world. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, expanding conflict, and escalated impacts on climate change threatening global prosperity pose critical global challenges. To overcome those challenges, we need to advance universal adherence to the rule of law. An international expert panel will discuss current challenges, the different perspectives, how failure to adhere to the universal principles of the declaration impedes economic growth and sustainable development, and how societies are strongest when development is anchored in democracy, justice, human rights, and the rule of law. And these are not just abstract concepts. These, concepts really impact our everyday life and the quality of life of our people. So without more, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Secretary of Legal Affairs of the OAS, Jean-Michel Arrigui. Thank you, Jean-Michel. Welcome to the panel, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be today with you, with so many important organizations in a long working day. I am very glad to be part of this webinar. But we are also in the Americas having to join us for 25 years of the approval of the declaration, Inter-American Declaration on Development of International Law in the Americas. That's also a very important date for us. But rule of law, democracy, sustainable development, the role of lawyers in a nutshell is much more than I can do in few minutes. Let me focus in some of those challenges, in particular in how our American states can afford the Sustainable Development Goals established by the United Nations, to which all the American states belong. I'm going to refer to them, but among all the goals, I'm going to focus on goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Those are key elements of the rule of law. Many targets are set by this goal, all tending to firm up the democratic rule of law, ensuring access to justice, putting an end to different types of human rights violation, fighting corruption, strengthening the participation of developing countries in international bodies, guaranteeing access to information, and strengthening the relevant national institution through international cooperation. All this makes lawyers and the law the protagonist of this embodiment, as just said the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro. I will speak about the Inter-American sphere. Allow me to run through the challenges, achievements, difficulties, and failures that have been encountered along the way. I am sure that many of those aspects are also shared in many regions. The Inter-American system has been working towards those goals for a long time, ever since it was established, and not always recognized even by ourselves, the Americans. We are the most peaceful continent in the relation between states. All our conflicts are resolved, and the court knows that, the International Court of Justice knows very well that, between states by the judicial settlement or bilateral agreements. In those difficult moments, and I joined the hope for peace in Ukraine, where aggression, invasion, and violation of basic rules of international law, that is something we need to preserve. Pioneering enshrinement of representative democracy as a form of government, as a norm approved from the Charter of the OAS in 1948, that's also a pioneering goal that we are dealing with that in international law. Some legal steps that were also pioneering: human rights, legal equality of states, what this implies, equality when the vote, the participation in all the political bodies in the organization in equal conditions. The creation of regional institutions addressing a wide variety of issues, battling corruption, the first convention, standards, success. Naturally, much still remains to be done, but much progress has been made across the board. Electoral fraud, military coup are not the same, are part of our, I hope, past. The law is a policy that succeeds. So we must also take into account not only the law, but also that we are facing division, ideological difference, many threats in some countries to our democratic values. And that brings us to same challenge for lawyers today, because they are challenged for the law as a whole, both national and international. Today, it is very difficult to imagine a situation, whatever it may be, that is not regulated at the same time by national and international rules, a challenge for the national lawyer, not for the international lawyer. We resolve that very easily, but for national lawyers. If you think in the trade, you take any product you have on your table, that means the mixture of a lot of trade all over the world that need to work. The telecommunication, it's a good case. Those are many, many examples. It's impossible today for a national lawyer to avoid international law too. At the same time, this COVID situation that I hope is finishing one day has given rise to new challenges that as lawyers we need to address for the future. Difficulties in accessing the courts, development of new forms of crime, solidarity among countries, even those linked by very solid integration process, which have closed their borders, engaged in struggle over access to vaccine, etc. We are now in a new step. Vaccine has covered our countries, but we saw how fragile is our system of cooperation. We need to improve seriously our international system. It's not in a solitary way that we can survive. It's in a solidarity way. And law and lawyers have an important role. We take each of the goals, 16 targets, one by one, and see what is the legal response that we have been giving, at both at the level of our countries and the inter-American level in our case. For each of these targets, rules have been drawn up, but it is not enough. They must be enforced. A Martian who arrives and only knows the rules would say, what a paradise is that world in each of our countries. And if he takes this as a basis for assessing how well the targets have been met, we would say mission accomplished. But that is not the case. As lawyer, our challenge, which has increased in these COVID times, is to ensure compliance. And this will require redoubled efforts from institutions, such as the Inter-American Bar Association, the American Bar Association, the Union des Avocats, all the organizations that we are together working today in that marathon, raising awareness among our lawyers about the world in which they most practice their profession, access to knowledge of different legal arrangements, and promoting means to facilitate access to justice for all citizens. Thank you very much and have a very, very good journey today.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. Thank you for your presentation and joining us in this panel discussion. We are going to continue the panel with Jad Kessler, our president, the Inter-American Bar Association president. He's currently not been able to join us live, for health reasons, but he kindly sent us an audio that Charlie will help us play after I make the introduction. Jed Kessler spent most of his early career as a lawyer for the U.S. Agency for International Development, living and working in Latin America, and finally serving as chief counsel for the Middle East. He joined the Porter Wright, Morris, and Arthur International Business Practice Group in Washington, D.C. For the past 20 years, he has become a widely experienced arbitrator in major international commercial and investment disputes. He serves currently as president of the Inter-American Bar Association and has been supporting the organization, actually been a member for over 4 decades, and supported the organization even before he assumed the presidency. So we apologize on behalf of Jad, and we'll just mention that he, having the conversations about this event, he wanted to reflect on the threats to democracy, the autocrats' threats to democracy. And we can say, that threat happens and operates not only at the national levels, but also there are threats at the international level. And we are seeing, a terrible threat, today, and we call on, adherence to the rule of law. Charlie, could you please play the audio, that Judge's audio and his message? Thank you.
I am speaking to you in this form because of an inconvenience, but I do have something I hope is relevant and important. Important as the sustainable goals are, and the connection between sustainable development and the rule of law, it seems to me that there's another subject that is very pressing at the moment that deserves to be mentioned. We in the United States aren't usually as frank as we should be to say that a lot of our success arises from absolutely dumb luck. What I'm thinking of at the moment is that among our founders, we had James Madison, who became our fourth president. And James Madison had an extremely jaundiced view of human nature, not of all humans, but he knew that among the human race, there would be people who were incredibly power hungry, greedy, and without the care and thoughtfulness and consideration that lawyers are supposed to have, and that we has given rise to the rule of law. It was very wise of him to build into our system many checks and balances, our federal system, the Electoral College. Some people think that we have more protections than we really need, but at least he had his head screwed on right, and he knew what the dangers were. Many countries did not have these, or by their culture, didn't enforce them if they did have them. While that is all well and good, and while the U.S. has, by and large, found political figures through democracy that maintained our situation, it is quite clear that things have changed in the world generally, and that it makes the task of having the rule of law enforced more difficult. It was one thing to have just a charismatic leader, some good, some bad in history. But in those days, there were only a few communications media available to people. The politicians had difficulty communicating directly with people. And of course, with video, you not only hear the politicians, but you see them and you become connected with their personalities. This has led to a great deal of thought on the part of autocratic leaders as to how to manipulate communications, to manipulate even the thought processes of people in other countries to the advantage of an autocrat elsewhere. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to say that at the moment, we who are in favor of the rule of law and attempting to strengthen it and make it more meaningful throughout the world are up against a real battle. We have a lot to think about how to protect media in a number of different ways, and to see the dangers of people who are charismatic but not necessarily constructive, having thought a great deal about how to use them. And so we need to combat that. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Jad. I mean, really, because despite of a last minute, situation he had to attend, he really delivered on us with this, excellent, presentation and so true words. We were, talking about these issues where we were coordinating the panels and presentations, and definitely the threat of autocrats was the major theme, but also important what makes a democracy strong enough and solid enough to be able to stand the test of time and the test of those threats too, because they happen all over the world, including, sort of one of the oldest or the oldest democracy, paradigm. So without more, I would like to introduce Sidney Sanchez. We have the honor to have Sidney with us. He's the president of as we mentioned before, of the Brazilian Institute of Lawyers, and hopefully I said it right in Portuguese, Sidney, the Instituto dos Advogados Brasileiros. Thank you. Sidney is, well, as we all know, very intuitively, in this case, he's a lawyer, he has a law degree by Pontificia Universidad Católica de Rio de Janeiro. He has a master's degree in cultural property and social projects granted by the History Department of Getulio Vargas Foundation, a very well-respected foundation in Brazil. Postgraduated in Law of Economics and Corporate at the EFG, Getulio Vargas Foundation, is vice chair of the legal committee of CISAC, International Confederation of Societies of Authors and Composers, and he is currently the president of the Institute of Brazilian Lawyers, chairman of the Authors' Rights Committee of the Brazilian Bar Association also, and he's been recently actually installed as the president, so we congratulate him again and welcome him to the panel. Sidney, the floor is yours. He will speak to us about the rule of law and the challenges for Brazil in 2022. That's the headline of his presentation. And we talk about democracy and the rule of law and how it's being challenged and, in many countries, and how the forces, against democracy could be acting in several fields. So without more, Sidney, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you all on this panel. I'd like to salute the organizers, institutions, the panelists, Dr. Jean-Michel Arrig, Dr. Jude Kessler, unfortunately with us today, Dr. Rina Aliashlev, and our moderator, Dr. Lourdes Vins. It's really interesting that we are gathered in this 24 hours webathon to discuss the defense of the democratic rule of law. This reveals to us that the surveillance of the democracy and its principle must be permanent so that they are not affected. At the same time, being together today forces us to recognize that we are experiencing difficult times for the rule of law, eroded by many governments, by very tools of democracy. Are democracy at risk? Will they survive the disinformation war? Are we living in a moment of social rupture? These questions have been recurrent and the object of warm reflections. reaching powers through democratic ways to promote the shattering of civilizational achievements has been common and worrying. In these governments, national institutions are attacked, powers captured from the interest of the rulers, and disinformation an element of manipulations of the truth. The international institutions gather here have as principles to defend the democratic state of law, human rights, gender, and racial equality, justice, in short, the principles that guide democratic civilizations and serve to allow peaceful social coexistence and ensure public debate and democratic expressions of critical thinking that enables the implementations of public policies of interest to free nations. For us, participants of this event, women and men committed to democracy, sheltered in the broad spectrum of the democratic field, and attentive to the dignity of the human person, such principles seem to repeat the obvious, but unfortunately, in the storm times we live in, they come being heavily fought. It's not a Brazilian problem, but a global one, where the achievements of human integrations have been diluted in a worrying way. Flu times, for some authors, the end of democracies, times that provoke uncertainty, leveraged by new forms of communications between people, which concern and make our attention and that of institution obligatory. Certainly, in the case of Brazil, we still have a long way to go to develop socially, politically, and economically. We are an emerging country that still lives with daily violence against the poor civilian population. We live with parallel powers in the cities, constant institutional disrespect, misogyny, structural racism, contempt for diversity, many things. Really have a lot to improve. As we know, active, concrete actions, whether collective or individual, are the true engines of the development of human history and responsible for political phenomena. For this reason, it is up to the institution responsible for safeguarding commitments to human rights and gender, racial equality, and respect for diversity to intensify their actions in order to preserve the sanity of humanity. The last few years in Brazil have clearly revealed the difficulties faced by the democratic field. We are still suffering the consequences of a persistent pandemic that took more than 2 years of our existence and caused more 660,000 deaths and more than 30 million cases in Brazil. During this period, we are exposed to a scientific denialism, to magic formulas of solution contrary to the science, and we saw the aggravations of social difference in the country. Our Constitution of 1988 is a text that guarantees individual and fundamental rights, public liberties, and has represented great advances in our citizenship, social rights, political rights in the last 33 years. Now these principles are under attack. Unfortunately, such constitutional achievements of the Brazilian state have been dismantled in recent years. The current government has weakened environmental policy. Only last month, more than 1,000 kilometers of Amazon forests were devastated. The government deactivated all cultural policy, does not recognize the authority of powers, does not recognize judicial decisions, attacks the Supreme Court, feeds hate speech and intolerance, encourage the arming of the population. This entire arsenal of policy against democracy is managed by controversial rules and through digital platforms, which, as in all countries, today directly interfere in social structures with the ability to define the courses of democracies. The conduct of our lives through algorithms, which according to the writer, K20 should be called algorithms of mass destruction, demand collective and global solution that will preserve the social structure. It's not a matter of denying technology, but of seeking to understand the seriousness of the historical moments, which imposes on organized society the obligation to promote a debate on digital accountability that ensure the preservation of people's freedoms and their choices. The Institute Brazilian of Lawyers, with almost 180 years of existence in a history of a struggle for freedoms and democracy, follows the Brazilian electoral process with concern and attention. The Bolsonaro government has made repeated attacks on the widely tested electoral system and electronic voting machines, whose model has international recognition and security and audit. The attacks have intensified, and this year will be one of many challenges. The work that the Superior Electoral Court and the Supreme Court have been doing to maintain the health of the electoral process should be praised and encouraged, but it's not easy. The work to combat the fake news should be day by day and tireless, and with the press having relevant role in this process. In this scenario of uncertainties, social networks must be charged to prevent the spread of disinformation, hate speech, and intolerance. Because in this new public space, the great dispute will be fought. The strategy of the anti-democratic actors is precisely to delegitimize the powers constituted and conduct to social distrust in order to create an environment of institutional rupture. We have no doubt that in Brazil, the retrograde forces are acting deliberately, and given the opportunity, they will harm the democratic pillars. The recent history of our country and countries of Latin America has instructed us that the social and economic throwbacks of dictatorial regimes must be forgotten. Permanent vigilance, firmness of purpose, and joint reaction by civil society and entities and constituted powers, especially the judiciary and the legislative, will be fundamental to avoid the disruption of our democracy. The Instituto Brazilian of Lawyers, especially to defend democracy, election, and press freedom. And we work together with other civil society entities in defense of the democratic rule of law and the Constitution. We have a historical obligation to rise up against this state of things. Brazil is the largest country in Latin America and cannot succumb to arbitrariness under penalty of contaminating the entire region. The rights of a human person are rights valid at all times for all peoples. They are rights of human nature, therefore inviolable, universal, atemporal, and just naturalistic. The support of the international community in the defense of freedoms and the rule of law in the electoral process will be fundamental for the preservation of the young Brazilian democracy and our Constitution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you for this great, presentation and reference to the challenges that, Brazil faces today in terms of the threats to the rule of law. In the Q&A, we'll have some, interesting questions to, go more into that and to ask you more about your experience and the possibilities there too. I will go now to introduce Irina. Again, welcome Irina, and thank you for joining us. Irina Paliashvili, hope I pronounce it correctly. And Irina is a founding member and managing partner of Ukraine Legal Group, a law firm with offices both in Washington, D.C. and Kiev, Ukraine. She is the chair of the legal committee of the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council and member of the SPPI Advisory Board, International Bar Association, the IABA. She's going to talk about, the main topic of this whole webathon, but specifically focusing on the impact on social and economic development and her experience, particularly on these two. When we talk about this, we talk about the interesting aspect that Irina has about, living and practicing in the US and in Ukraine at the same time, and having this, rich experience of having lived and operated in a democracy that, has over, 200 years, and to have also, lived and operated in a democracy that it's by historic times, at least, young, but that, a country and its people who had really make a strong bet for democracy and freedom. So we thought that would be a, really very important experience to relate to and focus not only at the domestic level, but also at the international level, especially in the context of where we are suffering and unjustified aggression to their country. Thank you, Irina. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. I want to use this opportunity to thank IABA and other organizers to speak at this important event. We, as a Ukrainian legal community, feel strong support from our colleagues and professional organizations around the world, and we are very, very grateful for that. Before I speak about global rule of law, I want to put this in the context of the current crisis and will explain why this current war in Ukraine is a crisis of epic proportions and why Ukraine is shielding the world from the global disaster. And when I talk about global disaster, I not only speak of the grave threat to the rule of law, international world order, and existing borders. I also speak of economic and environmental disasters. You probably have heard that global food security depends on Ukraine, which is one of the largest suppliers of food in the world. And the United Nations now warns of world famine due to Russian destroying and mining Ukraine's farmlands, stealing crops from the territory they control, and illegally blocking Ukrainian ports of Black Sea and Azov Sea. Also, global nuclear security depends on Ukraine because Ukraine has several major nuclear power stations located in the middle of Europe, and 2 of them were captured by Russian forces and looted, even of necessary equipment. Same with global environmental security, and also substantial damage is also inflicted on global supply chain, which triggers all kinds of negative economic consequences on the global scale. Overall, Russian imperialism today is #1 threat to global security because it aims at redesigning the global security and rule of law system, proposing redividing the world and recreating colonialism in its ugliest forms. Russia openly threatens not only Ukraine, it also threatens to target the Baltic states, Poland, and more recently, Finland and Sweden. Countries of the Central Asia and Caucasus regions also do not feel safe, with Georgia already being attacked and partitioned in 2008, and increasing threats being addressed to Kazakhstan. Russia sees itself at the center of the New World Order because it believes in its inherent superiority and historic mission, and that is similar to Hitler's superior race theory. Their New World Order is a world where only the force delivers the results rather than any principles of law. And by watching the horrific images from Ukraine, you are seeing what it means in practice. So why Ukraine is on the forefront of this assault? This is because Russia believes that Ukraine is the biggest obstacle on the way to its world domination. And they're right. Ukraine never before in history, and also today, does not want any part of this imperialistic agenda. And here I would like to go back in history and talk a little bit about Ukraine and its relations with rule of law and democracy. Lourdes said that Ukrainian democracy is a new democracy. I would rather prefer the term renewed democracy. Today, Ukraine is a peaceful, free, democratic country in the heart of Europe. It is open and tolerant, embracing all of its citizens of numerous ethnic backgrounds and religious beliefs. I, for example, am not of Ukrainian ethnic background. I'm Georgian, but I have lived in Ukraine all my adult life and never had any problems of not being ethnic Ukrainian. Ukraine has been an integral part of Europe since it was founded as Kievan Rus more than 1,000 years ago. Kievan Rus for a long time has been the center of the Slavic statehood, law, and culture. It reached the heights of its power and prosperity in the 10th and 12th centuries and was strongly connected with the rest of Europe. This resulted in adoption of Christianity and Christian law more than 1,000 years ago. Moscow didn't even exist at that time. Thereafter, Mongols invaded Slavic lands and have controlled them off and on for about 3 centuries, but Kiev has endured and Ukrainians fought for independence and reunification of their lands. It is interesting that the part of Ukraine populated by Cossacks, who were free, militarized peasants, has been ruled by democratic methods, which probably was the earliest democratic tradition in Europe. The head of Cossacks, called Hetman, was elected by popular vote and had to refuse the honor 3 times before agreeing to accept it. The Philip Orly Constitution of Free Cossacks was adopted 300 years ago and was the first democratic constitution of Europe. Soon thereafter, unfortunately, Ukraine was occupied by colonial Russian Empire for almost 3 centuries, but Ukrainians never gave up their identity, culture, and language. In the early 20th century, after the Bolshevik Revolution, Ukraine became an independent democratic state, but then again was occupied by the Red Army and was forced to join the USSR. Ukraine has been newly independent for 30 years, joining the free world, building a liberal democracy and market economy. The USSR, and this is a fact that Russia today is trying to conceal, but the USSR was dissolved 30 years ago at the initiative of the Russian Federation. And this was accompanied by its binding international law obligations and treaties to respect the borders of newly created states, including Ukraine. No promises whatsoever were made to the Russian Federation or anyone else that Ukraine will not join EU or NATO. At that time, by the way, Ukraine had the 3rd largest nuclear weapons arsenal in the world, which was the single solid guarantee of our security. But the US and the UK, in the interest of nuclear non-proliferation, which is a very respected cause, spearheaded the effort to take that nuclear arsenal away from Ukraine and to transfer it to Russia, in exchange for guarantees of Ukraine's sovereignty and borders. The so-called Budapest Memorandum was signed in 1994 by Ukraine, US, UK, and the Russian Federation with reciprocal binding obligations of all parties. Ukraine has complied with its obligations, while the Russian Federation has been violating them since 2014. The US and the UK are also bound by legal and moral obligations to defend Ukraine. The military aggression against Ukraine was first started by the Russian Federation in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and occupation of parts of Donbas region. In February of this year, the Russian Federation waged a full-fledged barbaric war against Ukraine. This year, the year of the 10th anniversary of the UN Declaration of the Rule of Law, I think we can all ask ourselves the question, regardless of challenges and glitches with the rule of law and democracy, what will happen to the world, to all of us, if the rule of law and democracy will be defeated? This is not a theoretical question, because we are watching an answer to this question unfolding in front of us every day in real time. The answer is it will bring total and unchecked aggression, unspeakable atrocities, crimes against humanity, genocide, and state-sponsored terrorism. Instead of rule of law, we will end up with the law of the jungle, with violent chaos on the global scale. After the Second World War, the UN system was created to never again allow this to happen and to ensure global security of law. But as we have been witnessing, the system has not been able to prevent or to stop the brutal military aggression the Russian Federation has been waging against different nations and countries, occupying and partitioning them, such as Chechnya, Syria, Georgia, culminating in the full-fledged war against Ukraine. This means that the Russian Federation has been systematically and blatantly violating its own multiple and fundamental international obligations, violating international law, ignoring all resolutions and rulings by the key global international institutions, such as the United Nations General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, OSCE, and others. This disregard to international institutions was cynically demonstrated during the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' recent visit to Kiev, when Russia hit the residential city center with the rockets around the time of his press conference. One person was killed and many were injured. The current system, where the main aggressor is a permanent member of the UN Security Council with a veto power, is absurd. It is widely known that Russia has been the most blatant abuser of the veto power, having this power even on the matters of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. In other words, the aggressor, which waged a full-scale war against another sovereign country, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, not only votes on the matters of the aggression it waged, but also has a veto power over any decision. Can we imagine a brutal murder trial with overwhelming evidence where the murder suspect is placed on the jury? This is not only absurd, but also extremely dangerous for the world peace and for the global rule of law. There was a talk about reform of the Security Council, of the veto power going on for a long time. But a small first step for the reform was recently initiated by Liechtenstein and 83 other countries to counterbalance the abuse of the veto power by a permanent UN Security Council member. This proposal was adopted by the UN General Assembly resolution on 26th of April, which mandates a General Assembly meeting within 10 working days of the casting of a veto by one or more permanent members of the Security Council, and also mandates to include in the provisional agenda of the next General Assembly session an item called use of the veto. This is a step in the right direction, but obviously a fundamental reform not only of the Security Council, but of the entire global security system is needed. This reform also needs to include the new effective system of liability and enforcement of liability for the massive war crimes, as well as providing prompt and adequate compensation for the victims. To this end, the recent PASSE resolution calls for the ad hoc International Criminal Tribunal and compensation mechanism, which is fully supported by the Ukrainian legal community. There were historic precedents for such ad hoc international criminal tribunals, starting, of course, with the Nuremberg Tribunal after the Second World War. There is ample evidence the Russian forces are systematically and on a mass scale committing acts of genocide and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. This is not a conventional military campaign and not a conventional army. This is the deliberate destruction and terror of civilians and civilian infrastructure by sadistic gangs of murderers. There is some debate among legal experts whether the atrocities committed by the Russian Federation amount to genocide. And here I speak about legal definition of genocide provided in Article 2 of the UN Convention on Genocide. Well, Putin, who routinely plagiarizes Hitler, called for the solution of Ukrainian question, which is direct reference to the Nazis' final solution to the Jewish question during the Second World War. Russia's solution to Ukrainian question means destroying Ukraine and annihilation of Ukrainians. Kremlin and its propagandists said this many times before and pronounced it in no uncertain terms in the article published in April by the Russian state news agency RIA, which speaks for Kremlin. The article was entitled, "What Should Russia Do with Ukraine?" and openly calls for the genocide of Ukrainians in order to force them to abandon their own nationality, culture, and language. The main thesis of this article is the extermination of Ukrainians as an ethnic group through so-called de-Ukrainization and de-Europeization of Ukrainians. The retired federal prosecutor of the United States, Bogdan Vitvitsky, wrote the following. Typically, the hardest element to prove in these kinds of cases is intent. What is extraordinary in this case is that Putin and the Russians have literally bragged about what they intended to do in Ukraine and Ukrainians. So intent is not an issue. I don't see how these crimes do not qualify as genocide. Apart from legal assessment, several key political leaders, including President Biden and President of Colombia, Marquez, have recognized the war in Ukraine as genocide. President Marquez said, "What is happening in Ukraine is genocide, and that must be stopped. This is madness." After less than 3 months of the full-scale war, numerous examples of genocide have emerged. I will not explain them here. You could see it in real time every day on the television. I only want to add as a lawyer that these crimes are being thoroughly documented. Actually, it is said that probably the war in Ukraine is the first completely documented war with objective and undeniable evidence. Ukrainian citizens benefit from several platforms that allow them to document atrocities, including the one provided by IABA, International Bar Association. It is really mind-boggling to comprehend all of what is going on today, but we must comprehend it and must take action to stop the carnage in Ukraine and to prevent a global disaster. As international legal community, this is our primary obligation to safeguard international rule of law and to help Ukraine, which today is shielding the world from destruction. We must fight and do everything we can, wherever we are, to help Ukraine withstand this horrible aggression and to help Ukraine win. After Ukraine wins, I think there will be a very serious effort to reform the current global security and rule of law system. There is a lot to be done, and we used to call our international colleagues to stand with Ukraine. But now we call you to stand with Ukraine and to win with Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irina, for your really great and clear presentation of the legal definitions at the international level and the situation that is going on there. In the Q&A that we will start now, we will ask a few questions that might help you to also understand and draw on the parallel of, your experience here and your experience there. And I like your reference. I think it's probably more accurate about a renewed, bet for democracy. I mean, I'm not going to go into which is the oldest one because I don't want to, hurt any susceptibilities. Then there will come the Greeks and there will come others. but true, it's true. It's a renewed bet for democracy and a strong one at it. And let's not forget that it was over 90% of your population who voted for freedom. So that's really an impressive one. I don't know if when I introduced Sydney, I did this, but I'd rather do it twice that be remiss and omit it. I'd like to definitely thank, Paulo Lins Silva, a great, Brazilian lawyer who's been president of the UIA and also president of the IABA, among other leadership roles, who was kind and gave us great support to, to be able to have Sydney with us today. So thank you, Sydney, and thank you, Paulo, if you are listening there. And we will go now to the Q&A. So I will ask all our panelists to have their cameras on, and Charlie will probably transfer us the questions that we might have on the chat. But we do have a few questions, and Jean-Michel also gave a great presentation. By his instructions, I introduced him only as Secretary of Legal Affairs of the OAS, which is a lot, actually. When I say only, it doesn't mean it's a lot, but he really have a great, experience and, great academic work too. And I cannot say that I couldn't take in your English accent, some of your French influence and education. And he lectures, and, several universities around the globe, expert international public law. So I would like to start, since we started the panel with you, Jean-Michel, maybe asking you what, if you could, I know this is a very broad and deep, answer question, but if you were to summarize sort of the three most important threats and challenges to the rule of law on the region and the American system, but also the three more important opportunities to, try to overcome those challenges, what would you tell us?
Okay, thank you. Very short, because that is too broad. The first one, I'm talking between lawyers and about the challenge for lawyers. There are challenges for the scientists, the challenge for a lot of areas. For lawyers, the first, I think, that is access to justice. The second is to strengthen the juridical cooperation between states, but that more and more important. And the third, of course, is to strengthen the democratic values. I think that those are the three of the challenges. They are much more fighting against corruption, fighting against organized crimes. But that is part of the legal cooperation, strengthening the judicial system. Is the judicial system with fighting against corruption, independence of the judiciary, cooperation between strengthening law. But not only law, we have too many law. The problem is not the law, the problem is the enforcement of the law. And that is the challenge for lawyers, judges, diplomats, all who works in this context. Those are challenges. Those are the big picture. Inside you have to put fight against corruption, fight against organized crime, strengthen the legal cooperation, etc.
Mhm. Thank you. And if you think about the opportunities and how can we address it and collaborate, because
working together more and more, activities like this one, exchanging experience, best practices, and working also with judiciary and working also with the Congress and the public opinion. Those are things, because if we discuss between lawyers, we'll agree in everything in 10 minutes.
Mhm.
This is not the problem. The problem is how we work outside of our little world.
Mhm.
Those are a small world. We are all together. We will have a meeting maybe in 6 months, and we will be together, and we will be all agree in everything. What we need is to work outside our world, how to deal with, convince the Congress about the importance of that, the public opinion. And I think that one thing is very important. We have to work much more with the faculties of law. The faculties of law is where we will have the new generation of lawyers, of judges, of congressmen or congresswomen. That is very important, to work much more with the young generation. We are old, we are convinced, we agree in everything, but that's not enough. We need to convince the new generation that they are working in a completely different environment that was our environment where we be at the beginning of our work as lawyer. They are working in the world of internet, of I don't know what, and I don't know which world they will have in 10 years in telecommunication. That is our challenge for the future.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you, yeah, and Michelle. It's really a big challenge, isn't it? It seems that we can summarize it into things, but as you say, it's a very complex issue. One of the issues that you touched upon was also the issue of corruption. We have diverse panels, talking about different topics that really affect the rule of law and impact social and economic development. And definitely there is a big cost of billions of money that get distracted from development that go because of corruption, isn't it? So that's a very clear case of impact on economic development and social development too. When we talk about corruption, it gets quantified. It's very concrete, it's very specific. So let's ask you and maybe the rest of the panelists then, in terms of the concrete impact, because as you say, this is for lawyers, but we need to talk to new generations, but also beyond the legal community, because at the end it's everyone's job, isn't it? And it's everyone's interest. So to convince and persuade other people to really sort of march for the rule of law and to make a vigil for the rule of law in some ways that we're trying to do here with this 24-hour telethon, to convince other people that they are a person that is not from a legal background. What would you, recommend in this case? How do we get them on board with this agenda of strengthening the rule of law?
To me? You're asking to me?
Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I don't know. We need to think about that. That is completely different in each country, in each society, in each way. We have to work much more with public opinion, with press, with political institution, with civil society. But that's something that we need. It's very, when we talk about corruption, is much more than corruption. Corruption is because there is organized crime, because there is, but I don't know if there is much more corruption now than yesterday or than we will have tomorrow, but something is happening. We are dealing with public opinion who now is talking about corruption. We have countries where all the former presidents are on jail. and that is a change. Now public opinion knows about that. That is a window for us lawyers to improve our fighting for justice and for more rights. But I think that one of the matter to have a so big conference like you are organizing today, it's not only to have a dialogue between us, is to propose something to do after that. Because as you know, I'm a member of many international organizations of law. We are always the same. At the end, we are always the same 100 people that we are together, that we know better. We read us, we put us in footnotes one to each other, but that's not enough. We have to go to do something outside. And maybe that one of the conclusion of the meeting can be, what can we do to sell the idea of rule of law, of democratic rule of law? How to do it in a moment where democracy and the values are on challenge in many of our countries all over the world. And I said all over the world, the US, the Latin America, Europe, Africa, etc. There is a polarization, there is a big threat for democracy and rule of law. The COVID put to challenge the relation between states, put on challenge the relation between the freedom of people, etc. And then we need to reinforce the idea of democratic rule of law as very important for our life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Michel. We will, we're looking for questions from the chat too. So if you have a question, please, share it through the chat and we will, transfer it to the panelists or relate them to the panelists. I would like to ask Sydney, talking about Brazil, sort of in your view, would it be possible to prevent the growth of arbitrary acts? I mean, do you see the threat, that you've been describing in terms of democracy to go as far as, maybe that's a big question, but as far as producing sort of a breaking on the democratic commitment? And one thing that I think it's important when we talk about rule of law and democracy to maybe elaborate, and maybe Sydney, you can help us in that regard. And then if the other panelists would like to add to that, you are welcome. It's to elaborate in the idea of democracy also and what we understand with it. And if we are just talking about elections or we are talking about actual democracies, representative democracies, where it's not only that you get elected, but also that you represent the will of your people. Sydney, I hope it's not to pick up a question, and I trust that you will be creative enough to give us an answer to this one in a brief time. But please.
Yeah, I think that most of the I think I can use the answer of Jean-Michel. Jean-Michel, I think, showed us a broad view of what we really have to do in order to defend democracy, in order to defend rule of law. In case of Brazil, it could be the question of 1 million. Because we live in a very difficult moment, but of course we have to manage of this situation. But in the case, even the government intends to remove, for example, official powers. I really believe that we still have organization and institution that are able to resist. Of course, not easy. National institutions are being weakened today, but it's, I really believe, but it's still strong enough to keep the country in line with democracy. I really hope. And in that moment, this moment, in my opinion, the press is another valuable tool to preserving elections, to preserving democracy, to show what's happening. Of course, it depends on freedom to work. And as Jean-Michel Agui said to us, even Irina, we really need the support of the international community. It is strategic to prevent any attack. Today we live in a world community. The way of communication that we share information is a value. Then it is an important tool. We, as the example of Ukraine, it's a good one, because part of the resistances is from out of Ukraine. Then I believe that we have mechanism to manage this way to capture democracy and capture in order to weaken the democracy. It's a way to announce the risk that we have. Then I believe that it's really possible that we live in the international community today is it's easier to be more close than other times, and then we have to use this tool in order to defend the rule of law, the democracy, and in order to preserve our conquest, civilizational conquest. I think it's this.
Thank you. Thank you, Sydney. I don't know if any of our panelists, Irina or Michelle, would like to add something to this, or we can go with the next question.
I would like to go up a little bit. When Michelle was talking about how do we spread the good word about rule of law among non-lawyers, and what do we do, what specific actions we can undertake. And I can use here an example of International Bar Association, IABA. Several years ago, they launched a campaign, public campaign in support of rule of law. They have done several videos that were widely disseminated for free among many countries of the world. I think this campaign maybe can be renewed or integrated using such platforms as Netflix, for example, which does a lot of documentaries and which reach hundreds of millions of people all around the world. I have watched recently a documentary made by a prominent French philosopher and author, Bernard-Henri Lévy. And this is a documentary about war zones around the world. So if this documentary is paired with a strong message about how rule of law can actually help to solve those problems, and made available to general public through these global platforms, I think that could be one of the ways. And the other follow-up that was, what Jean-Michel and Sydney were talking about, democracy and representative democracy, and that was your question too. And one observation I can make in the last probably, especially during the last presidential administration in the United States, that there is a very strong disregard for the opposition. I think the rights of the opposition in every democracy have to be respected because the opposition represents part of the public. It's also part of democratic mechanism. And the opposition is also a safeguard, part of the checks and balances system, watching over the ruling party or the ruling class. So I think it's really very unfortunate, this huge polarization between the ruling parties and opposition, and that's everywhere in the world. So I think that we as lawyers, we should really try to support the rights and respect for the opposition in democratic systems. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rina. Very good points, both of them actually. And you touched on a point that's very relevant to sort of the focus of the webathon, which is rule of law, but impact on social and economic development. And, thank you for sharing that source too, but it's how it helped to solve problems and how it impacts in terms of development. But also the counterpart of that is, how not, abiding by a rule of law system or by the rule of law principles really creates destruction, which is the antithesis of, development, of construction, of growth, and social and economic development. And we are seeing it sadly in a very, very concrete and, harrowing way, how not adherence to the principles of rule of law, not respecting the rules of the system could really, wreak havoc in communities and, the world, in local communities, but the world as a whole, because we all are interconnected, isn't it? So one thing impacts the other that you were mentioning before too. Definitely all these situations for one reason or the other, whether it's the impact of the sanctions that are necessarily and supported, but it still creates a lot of, difficult conditions for all the countries, even the ones who would like to abide by them, isn't it? So there is all this, shaking of the system when you break the rule of law, and any side of the world affects everyone. So that's something that we probably should reflect on. But talking about the representative, democracies that you brought again, and was part of the question. How do we curb these threats in some ways that there is a good use of media and there is a good use of social media, but there is also a misuse of social media that had been taken as a tool to create discourse that impacts the rule of law, that affects the rule of law. And when Jad was share his audio, he kind of talked about these threats, but also in conversation and also with Chair, he would say, for example, something like, governments that are democratically elected, including some of the world's oldest and most stable democracies, must demonstrate not only that they actually live by the rule of law, but that they can also prove that government under law is not just orderly. Those are just words, but it is effective in curbing corruption and improving the lives of their citizens. So that this manifests in concrete ways, isn't it? Because at the end, it's not just, being elected also. You have to be elected in what we consider fair and free elections or free and fair elections. But then once you are elected, you should abide by the norms that you swear to uphold, isn't it? So how these social media tools had eroded and what can we do to curb that and strengthen the rule of law? How they have eroded the system in many ways, creating polarization, as some of you mentioned.
Yes, could I begin?
Yes.
Yeah. Social media, it's a reality of our lives. And it's impossible to fight against them and the way of communication that we have today. But I think that this dialogue, we need to introduce a discussion about the regulations of the digital platforms, not to avoid the value that they have in our relationships, in our lives, but in order to preserve some principles. And I believe that these discussions it's more effective today than, for example, 10 years ago. This discussion is really strong in Europe. Discussion also in Brazil. We are discussing about this point, but in many regions of the world. And in my opinion, to have a good environment, new public place, new digital place to relationships in general. The digital platform should understand the responsibility that they have in this social structure in all over the world. I think it's one point really important to discuss in order to preserve rule of law.
Thank you. I don't know, Michelle, would you like to add something?
Yes, but corruption, we have corruption from the beginning of the history. We don't have to think that 20th century or 21st century, we are discovering new threats. Corruption exists from the beginning. Crime exists from the beginning. Bad press exists from the pamphlets, from the history, all over the history. I think that what we need is more, and we will not close the journal because there is one bad. We will not stop all the traffic of ships because one came with drugs. That's completely crazy. The world is working very well on a base of commercial cooperation. I always put an example. There is a very interesting book called Traveling with a T-shirt from an economist of the US. She took a T-shirt in a mall, I think that was in Miami, a white T-shirt, and she began to study the story of that T-shirt. The cotton came from Texas, they went to India. In India, they take that, then they send it to China. They send it after to Singapore to put the ticket, then they send it to Costa Rica to put, etc. And finally, after doing the tour of the world, the T-shirt finally arrived in Miami. And that you can do the same example for all the things you have in front of you, the cell phone, the shoes, the car, everything. And that is working well. It's one of the hundreds of transactions that we have to have the T-shirt from Texas doing the tour of the world and coming back to Miami. One of the transactions has a problem, you don't have the t-shirt. And you can do the same for the car, for the cell phone, for everything you have. That is what we need to improve, the good side also. But, we are talking too much on the bad side, and we are not convincing everybody that we need also to strengthen the good side of the cooperation. That's something we need to send the message. Cooperation, integration, it's not only bad. Press is not only the bad press. Telecommunication is not only the bad telecommunication. Commerce is not only for trafficking drugs. And corruption, it's because also we have investment. There is no corruption on the vacuum. Corruption is linked to the traffic of drugs, to the investment, to the construction of new buildings, of new, et cetera, but we are not stopping all the traffic of construction of bridges or roads because we have corruption in one case. What we need is to have stronger institutions. That's it. And the corruption is more complicated because it's easier to put on jail the guy who received the money, but there is very few cases, one maybe in Brazil, where they put on jail the guy who gave the money. People that need to receive money for many reasons, we will have from the beginning of the Moïse story until now, and we will have. We need to fight much more with the people who give the money. And that is where maybe we need to work a little more.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Michel. You are right. I mean, most of the challenges are new challenges. Maybe they take new dimensions because of, the changes, the technology, new means, means that help also, governments to develop, financial intelligence tools to try to curb it, but also where, the bad guys get more crafty in try to avoid them. But so it's the history, all history, if you want, with newer, tools. So in that regard, you are right. And there's also an important point that you make, which we always like to do with our panels. The ones who had participated know that is not just stressing the problems, but trying to think about, or the challenges of the threats, but think about the opportunities, what are the strengths that we have to face those challenges? What are the opportunities that we have to face those challenges, and try to end with a sort of message of hope, isn't it? There are challenges, but okay, what are the opportunities? So maybe this would be the focus of the last minutes of the panel, which is, what opportunities do you see? What mechanisms, what strong foundations do you think your systems can rely on to overcome and, fight these challenges? It's for the three of you.
Before we move to the opportunities and sort of positive conclusion, I understand that Jean-Michel wanted us to focus on the positive side, but I just want to do a little bit detour back to the negative side, unfortunately. And I want to unite the two topics. The first topic was that Sydney spoke in his remarks about disinformation. And then, you raised the question of social media. So unfortunately, these topics together are have a very destructive effect. And in terms of social media, I think one of the ways for us as a legal community to address it is to work very closely with the younger generations of our colleagues. And I'm very happy that Aisha is one of the co-partners or co-organizers of this event. So I think we really listen to them because they grew up inside the social media bubble. They understand it, and I think they are masters of it. So working closely and listening to the younger generations of our colleagues would be really a great tool for us. But, if social media sometimes has disinformation through social media has a chaotic effect, there is also a state-sponsored disinformation. And if we come back to the situation with Ukraine, one of the tools that brought to this was the state-sponsored disinformation campaign, which has been carried out by the Russian Federation for decades. And they were spending billions and billions every year on all kinds of news outlets that pretend to be like global official news outlets. To this end, one of the worst offenders is Russia Today. And it was actually prohibited in many countries. But unfortunately, as I know, it's still broadcasting in Spanish in several countries of Latin America. And I just want to call all of you to boycott this disinformation. The official disinformation is as bad as the social media disinformation. So there should be a lot of hygiene in terms of using sources from social media and from the state-sponsored disinformation sources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's very important points you do, Irina. Thank you. And by no means, we need to really, the only way to solve a problem is acknowledging. That's the first part. So we need to acknowledge definitely the challenges and the problems. But the only way to make progress and move forward is focusing also on the solutions and on the positive aspects and the strength elements to counteract that. Both are very important. And that's the balancing act that we need to do in life, in everything, isn't it? Acknowledging the problems, acknowledging the sort of, metaphorically speaking, the cancers or the virus of society, but also acknowledging the sort of elements that boost that societal immune system to talk in parallel with what we've been, facing in the last couple of years. So what are our antibodies and how can we fight these challenges, isn't it? How can we, as local communities and as a global community fight these challenges? So I will let Sydney and, or ask please Sydney and Jean-Michel if you would like to add something on the positive side, and how to strengthen the positive aspects of.
AI or
Yes.
yeah.
Sure.
So of course we have positive effects, and you must be positive. And then one of the positive aspects that we have lawyers, and it's really good. Lawyers in all over the world, in all countries, lawyers that understand the means of freedom, democracy, liberty, sense of the word. For example, in the case of Brazil, lawyers is part of our constitution. Then we understand how much is important to defend some principles, and I think it's a very positive aspect. Lawyers of the world always, as Jean-Michel said to us, we can understand easier about many subjects, and it's an example how positive that we are. And I believe in our force. I believe in our job and what we have to do in order to defend democracy and rule of law. believe in principles, believe in democracy, and I'm sure that we'll win.
Mhm. Thank you. Jean-Michel?
Yes, I fully agree with what Irina said about how we have the problem of the misinformation, but that is not new. During the Second World War, for instance, of course, the information was all misinformation, but it was very difficult the access to the right information. The BBC in the darkness of a radio somewhere, etc. Now, the young people that knows much better than us how to access to all the ways of telecommunication are able to receive also the misinformation, but they are able also to access via technologies to other information on an easier way. That is the channel that we as lawyers, we need to use because to do what Sidney said, to improve the idea of democracy, of law. In the 60s, there was the idea that democracy was a formal way, and that was not the real way to resolve the issues. And they give, in my country, for instance, space of guerrilla and everything like that. After that, they learned that the formal democracy is so important as the real democracy too. They are all together. Mm-hmm. But I think that now we are facing again a challenge on the idea of democracy. Mm-hmm. We have democracy in all the countries, but it's in challenge. Not only in Latin America, what happens in the US and the February 6th was completely new as a polarization in our country. The election in France, right now with 60% who vote for the polls, we have to work all over the world to convince, and I think that the new generation are our only way to do something.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And that is a challenge for we lawyers, how to convince a young that law is important. Mm-hmm. It's difficult. It's not easy in our world.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. We end with this last question because we're basically getting to the end of our time. There's a question, that they also shared with us that is, I think it is important to monitor and participate in the legislative proposals that create and change law. What do you think? It's basically, advocacy to impact the legislative process. I understand the question to be about. If you can, in 1 minute each, give us your opinion about this.
I can start, but this is all part of a bigger problem that we were discussing, and that's what you called to develop antibodies. How we can develop antibodies from the young generations so they know what democracy is. They know they have a right to participate in the legislative process. They're interested and they sort of take the torch and carry it. And one of the ways would be probably to start a campaign where we as lawyers go to schools, go to universities and talk to the younger generations, explain what democracy is about, what values are, what can you do as a citizen, including participation in the legislative process. And in Ukraine, for example, we have a so-called Leadership Academy. That's an NGO which takes the kids who graduate from the high school during their gap year before they go to the university for 1 year. And these kids are learning about democracy, they are learning about rule of law, they are learning about the values and how to exercise their rights as citizens. But this Leadership Academy, can be brought back to schools. And where I think our legal community of all generations can be very instrumental and be part of this campaign. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Irina. Michelle and Sydney, 1 minute each now, because then we'll have to close.
I will put another challenge. We are in our societies in all our countries where it's much more important to be a successful entrepreneur, a millionaire, Jeff Bezos, etc., than a good politician. That means that for young generation, they prefer to go to be a new Bezos or Bill Gates than to be a Churchill or a De Gaulle. And that's a problem that we have. And that is our universities that are promoting that criteria. And that's something we have to work. It's very good to have a Jeff Bezos. It's good also to have a Churchill. We need a society where they'll be all together. And we are facing a bad level each day in the Congress. And many of the congressmen and congresswomen are lawyers in all our countries. That's something we have to work. But as Irina said, we have to work at the level of young generation. That is our challenge.
Thank you, Jean-Michel. That's a great point. And that brings some concept that it's been, circulating in my mind, which is we have to make sure we don't have incompetent crises. If we can, create a new term, basically democracies that are, run, in an incompetent manner, because everybody suffers the consequence of that. But so now, Sydney, a minute for that question about the participation in the legislative process, please.
Yeah, I think that the quality of the parliaments depends on the participation of the society. And now society is under impact of the disinformation. It's not easy. We have to discuss for a good parliament, for a good participation, for young generation, understanding that it is important to occupy this space. Need better education, better information, and in order to change. But the portrait of in fact, today, in many countries, the portrait of the parliament is a portrait of the society. And it's a deep discussion about the public policies that should be changed, should be reorganized in many countries of the world.
Thank you very much, Sydney. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to our partner organizations, ABA, UIA, IABA, and Law Society of England and Wales, that together with the IABA had organized the webathon. Thank you to all our panelists, the Secretary General, Luis Almagro, for the opening remarks, Jean-Michel, Sydney, and Irina. Thank you all. And thank you to our team behind the scenes, to our teams, all our organizations, support teams behind the scenes for this. The event doesn't end now, we thank you for joining, but remind you that, this our unprecedented 24-hour webathon, lawyers across the globe and around the clock for the rule of law, does not stop here. At the top of the hour, which is almost now, we will go live to London to join the Law Society of England and Wales for a panel discussing closing the opportunity gap, overcoming economic and social inequalities through the rule of law. Thank you all. And thank you, Jad, our president, who joined us through the audio also. Thank you all. Goodbye. And wish you the best.